What are your favorite soundtracks? All right, well, welcome back. Sorry it's been a little while. I got busy, but let's move on to the next episode. I thought it'd be fun to do one on soundtracks. This is kind of a bonus episode. I know I've been kind of talking about my music history, especially when it comes to heavy music, left off at Ozfest, but I wanted to do one on soundtracks, so here we go. For me, I have to begin with La Bamba. First of all, I love the movie La Bamba, but it absolutely ruined me for flying in an airplane. Absolutely destroyed me. I saw that movie before I ever got on an airplane, so I was like kind of terrified of flying. So thanks for that, La Bamba. But more importantly, La Bamba was the movie that introduced me to like 50s rock and roll. Now these songs on the soundtrack were re-recordings of the original classic rock and roll songs, so the songs that were originally by Ritchie Valens were done by Los Lobos, and Marshall Crenshaw did one, and Brian Setzer did one, and I didn't really care that they were re-recordings. They sounded amazing, and it got me more into 50s rock and roll in the future. So La Bamba is definitely one of the first soundtracks I remember loving, but tied to that soundtrack also is Stand By Me. So the Stand By Me soundtrack was another introduction to 50s music as well. So you had Buddy Holly, you had the Del Vikings, the Chordettes, and so on and so on. And that soundtrack includes one of the top 5 songs of all time in my opinion, which is Stand By Me by Ben E. King. Just as long as you stand by me. So not only were they two of my favorite movies growing up, but the soundtracks were perfect companions to the films. All right, moving on. So staying in the 80s, there was a movie called Legend. Now, this was a movie with Tom Cruise and Mia Sara, and most importantly, probably Tim Curry as Darkness. Amazing. Now, the soundtrack was done by a band called Tangerine Dream. This soundtrack was probably one of my early introductions to synthesizers and the mood and atmosphere that you could create with synthesizers. The contrast of light and darkness in the film is captured perfectly musically, I think. Now, another movie around the same time was The Neverending Story. And The Neverending Story also depended on synthesizers a lot, and it really just transported you to this other world of Fantasia, of the swamps of sadness. I mean, it just like, as a little kid, it was just so awesome. And then obviously it had the song The Neverending Story by Lamal, which has become popular again because of Stranger Things, so awesome. The next soundtrack I thought of was the Dazed and Confused soundtrack. I mean, come on. Foghat, Alice Cooper, ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, Kiss, The Runaways. I mean, it was just a great introduction to 70s rock. Now, next, we're going to talk about Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Both of these soundtracks were the epitome of cool, okay? The slow motion walk of the Reservoir Dogs. Looking back on a track for a little greenback. Got to find just the kind. And then the dancing scene with John Travolta and Uma Thurman in Pulp Fiction. It was a teenage wedding and the old folks wished them well. Quentin Tarantino was a master of crafting these soundtracks. Little Green Bag and Stuck in the Middle with You, those songs are completely attached to Reservoir Dogs for me. Like, I can't hear them and not think of that movie. And the same way with Miserlou by Dick Dale, I can't hear that amazing lick and not think of Pulp Fiction. I mean, it's just completely tied together. Quentin Tarantino, I mean, without a doubt, he redefined the idea of cool in the 90s. All right, the next soundtrack I'm going to talk about is The Crow. I loved this movie. I saw it many, many times in the theater. This is possibly the greatest soundtrack of the 90s to me. It has some stiff competition, but it is so good. I mean, you had The Cure, Stone Temple Pilots, Nine Inch Nails, Pantera, Rage Against the Machine, Violent Femmes, Helmet, and then it had these other weird bands that I had never heard of before, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, Machines of Loving Grace, and again, like Legend and the Neverending Story, the mood and atmosphere that was created by this music, by these songs, perfectly matched the movie. The Crow was a dark gothic thriller that had an amazing soundtrack. Well, a one-of-a-kind soundtrack for a one-of-a-kind movie. Natural Born Killers. This film, very controversial, was schizophrenic, psychotic, frantic, and I think the soundtrack was too. That's why I think it had a big impact on me. Another thing about the film is it went from black and white to color and grainy video to clear, crystal clear video. Again, it was very schizophrenic. And when you listen to the soundtrack, you had artists like Patsy Cline next to Dr. Dre and L7 next to Leonard Cohen, and then Bob Dylan next to Nine Inch Nails. It was just all over the place. So Oliver Stone was able to create this insane movie, and he matched it well with the soundtrack.
My fate decided I'm a dead man walking.
So I remember when my amazing Aunt Joy, who is a nun actually, took me to this movie in the theater.
And the clouds above my prison move slowly across the sky.
An amazing film. Everybody should watch this movie. It's very, very good. The soundtrack is also excellent. It has Bruce Springsteen, Patti Smith, Mary Chapin Carpenter, Johnny Cash, obviously. But the reason this soundtrack is so important to me personally is because it introduced me to Tom Waits.
And you'll have to find your own way home, boys. You'll have to find your...
I had no category for him, and I really still don't. There is only one Tom Waits. There is nobody like him, really. And if you love him too, you know what I mean. He was another one of these artists, when I heard him for the first time, I didn't know what to do with it. I knew that I liked it, but I also knew that it was very weird and strange and totally outside my musical bubble at the time. But I was totally drawn to his delivery, his emotion, his odd way of singing, but I just couldn't get enough of it. Now on the soundtrack, there's two songs by him. One is a slower one, and then the other one is a little more upbeat and kind of sounds a little bluesy.
There are things I've done I can't erase. I want to look in the mirror, see another face. I said...
So that was my introduction to Tom Waits, and since then I've bought a lot of Tom Waits records, and he is without a doubt a national treasure. If you disagree, you're just wrong. All right, let's get into maybe the honorable mentions or guilty pleasures. On that list would be the Mannequin soundtrack, but maybe not the soundtrack, but maybe just the song by Starship, Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now.
Standing strong forever, nothing's gonna stop us now.
I mean, come on, that song is awesome. It's stupid and cheesy, but come on, I love it. And surprisingly, the Pretty Woman soundtrack, I remember buying that cassette when I was little, and it had like David Bowie, Roxette, it had that song by Go West, but it also had the song Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison, which is, you know, it's Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison. I really love the So I Married an Axe Murderer soundtrack. It probably introduced me to The Laws, that song they sang, There She Goes. I mean, that song is awesome. Soul Asylum is on there. Also, Spin Doctors, Two Princes. Again, you can call it a guilty pleasure, but I love that song. I'm just a child of the 90s in that way, I guess. I've probably watched that movie more times in my life than any other film I've ever seen, except for maybe Dumb and Dumber, which is also one of my honorable mention soundtracks. The last thing I'll talk about is my favorite film scores. In that category, I have to go with Last of the Mohicans, Rudy, Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, and Braveheart. Those are my favorite scores. Also to the list, I have to add Amadeus. The soundtrack to Amadeus. Amadeus is certainly one of my favorite films of all time, but the soundtrack probably played a huge role in me getting into classical music and learning how to love classical music. The movie and the soundtrack did that, so I have to put it on there. All right, that wraps up the soundtrack episode. I would love to know your favorite soundtracks or the ones that made the biggest impact on you. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.
Looking for some